Good morning, students. Today we take on the topic from yesterday, that is urbanization in southern Mesopotamia, temples and kings. Yesterday we had seen, or rather, we had touched about how temples were extremely important in the early societies, whereby uh, because of because of those temples, the whole society used to come around those temples. The whole because people from different lands used to come for pilgrimages, and the trading setups used to come around them. Different, many shops used to come around them. People started making rest houses so that those pilgrims could stay there, and so naturally a whole ecosystem came up and around those temple towns, and those temples were very actively supported by the ruling families and the kings, because the kings themselves were considered to be the representatives of gods on the earth, and that is why they wanted the people to see that yes, their proximity to the gods, their comfort with the gods, and how they respected those gods. And naturally, if people respected the gods, king always felt that yes, a bit of that would also come to them, because they happen to be the representatives of those very gods on earth. So if the people respected those gods, it was understood and it was seen that yes, people are also in love with the king and also respect the king. Now, coming to this paragraph, which the first few lines are very important. The god was the focus of worship. To him or her, people brought grain, curd, and fish. The god was also the theoretical owner of the agricultural fields, the fisheries, and the herds of the local community. Uh, it was considered that God owned everything. Okay, and students, this thing was not just something which was unique to the Mesopotamian civilization, or it was unique to the people who lived in those ancient time, that is 4,000, 5,000, or 6,000 years ago. This was something that God owned everything, and they were just using those resources, and the people just used those resources. This was very prevalent and a very strong sentiment in all the civilizations, whether you talk about the Latin American or the South American civilizations, or the Incas or the Aztecs, or even the Red Indians for that matter in North America, and then even in China for that matter, and very much in India as well, whereby till very late, and in fact even today, there are a lot of people who just believe that this is all God's stuff, we're just here to use it. So this is not something which was very unique to Mesopotamian civilization. This was very common and prevalent thought and a philosophy and an ideology which existed in different civilizations in different parts of the world. Okay. um, in spite of the natural fertility, agriculture was subject to hazards. Now, you have to understand that in those years, almost 90% of the economic activity happened around agriculture. And agriculture, then again, it is very nature dependent. It is nature dependent even today, right? The rainfall, the weather cycles, with the period of drought, the period of rains, if the rivers have flooded, they haven't flooded, the fertility of the soil, then if the insects and the pests have attacked the crop, all of that is much beyond the control of the farmer. It is all nature dependent. Okay. And that is the reason also why it was very important to keep the gods happy, because they were the ones who were believed to be controlling everything. So it was important that you respect those gods, because your whole economic activity was related to the things that were much beyond your control. You could not control anything. uh, okay, just a minute. Yes, this is a very important thing which we have, which I would like you to just understand. And this is another issue which happens even today. Those who lived on the upstream, that is, on the upper part of the river valley, stretches of a channel would could divert so much water into their fields that villagers downstream were left without water, or they would neglect to clean out the silt from the stretch of the channel, blocking the flow of water further down. So the early Mesopotamian countryside saw repeated conflict over land and water. Now, what exactly are they talking about? What they are saying is that the people, for example, before we go into Mesopotamia, let me just kind of give you an example. Say, for example, say if River Ganga is coming from the Uttarkashi areas and flowing through Rishikesh and Haridwar and all these places, and then finally going into the lower parts. Now, uh, if people from, say, Uttarkashi start diverting the flow of river Ganga into their respective areas where they have their own crops, they have their own fields where they sow crops. Now, then a bit of water then comes down to Rishikesh. Then people of Rishikesh also start diverting the river Ganga into different areas, and then it comes to Haridwar, and then Haridwar, the guys here are waiting to do to play a role in this mischief as well. So naturally, do you actually think that River Ganga, when it actually reaches places like Allahabad and Banaras, what would it be left with? So it was obvious that the people in Allahabad and Banaras would pick up. Not in There's no need to go that far actually. People even in Haridwar would start taking up battles and fights with the people in Uttarkashi as to how could you channelize River Ganga into your own fields. What would happen to our fields because most of the water is gone. So it was the same thing which used to happen in Mesopotamian civilization because the source of water, river, these were rather the two most important water systems, river Euphrates and Tigris, and the people living in the upper areas of the valley from where these rivers used to pass, they used to divert the water into their own respective fields, and the people living in the low areas used to receive less of water. And that is why there was always a conflict between people living in the upper areas and people living in the lower areas. And students, even today, even now, these two rivers are there, and the countries today, it's not just that the cities, the countries, Turkey is always in battle, in conflict with Iraq because of these two rivers. Turkey wants to build its own dams to harness this water and channelize this water for its own farmers, and the countries who are actually in the lower side, that is countries like Kuwait and Iraq, they are always picking up conflict and fights with Turkey as to, they, because their farmers are not receiving adequate water for their own farming. Now, so coming to this, so that is very important, because um, then coming to the topic of when there was continuous warfare in a region, those chiefs who had been successful in war would oblige their followers by distributing the loot and could take prisoners from the defeated groups to employ as their guards or servants so they could increase their influence and clout. Such war leaders, however, would be here today and gone tomorrow until a time came when such leadership came to increase the well being of the community with the creation of new institutions or practices. Now, students, this is quite important. Now, it is obvious that, because the people were always in conflict and sometimes fight with each other for the limited resources that they had. So, when a victorious ruler, when he had defeated the king of a particular kingdom or a particular land, he would take a lot of people from that land into his own. Okay, and because this land had come under his rule, and even if he did not want to rule directly, he would take the best of people, the best of brains, the the best of potters, the best of carpenters, the best of ironsmiths, soldiers into his own army or into his own administration, because if they were considered to be worthy enough. um, and so what the second sentence, that's so that however would he be however those kind of rules would be rulers would be here today and gone tomorrow, until a time came when such leadership came to increase the well-being of the community with the creation of new institution or practices. Now, gradually, because this, as the society was getting more and more complex, it was the need was felt to create institutions and not just get into this kind of war activity and loot and plunder, because this was not good. It was all very, very temporary. Society did not gain much in the long run. Students, you have you have seen, or rather you haven't as yet. Once in the other chapters, while we after a few chapters, you would study about the Mongols, and you would see that the Mongols ruled over half of the world when they were at the zenith of power, and they took thousands and thousands and thousands of slaves and engineers and all of them to their own lands, but they did not create institutions for them, and that is why the Mongol Empire disappeared after 3 generations. Okay, because the institutions had not been created. It was just kind of a collection and a horde of engineers and this, but then it was always loot and plunder and loot and plunder. So it was understood by the smart engineers that yes, you would have to create institutions. Just looting and plundering would not take you long. We can imagine a mutually reinforcing cycle of development in which leaders encouraged the settlement of villagers close to themselves to be able to rapidly get an army together. Besides, people would be safe living in close proximity to one another. At Uruk, one of the earliest temple towns, we find depictions of armed heroes the and their victims, and careful archaeological surveys have shown that around 3000 BC, when Uruk grew to the enormous extent of 250 hectares, twice as large as Mohenjo-daro, would be in later centuries, dozens of small villages were deserted. Now, Uruk grew up to be a very prosperous town, a very big town. But as I had said yesterday, that Uruk was one of the first, earliest recorded places or the urban settlements which was ravaged by the harshness of environment, because they had stopped worrying about and caring about the environment around them. They had started cutting a lot of trees to expand their own urban settlements, and the farmers had chopped off a lot of trees, and the whole jungles were wiped out to ensure that they could expand their farming lands to take care of the massive population of Uruk which was coming up. So it was a it was a double assault. The people were getting rid of and chopping off jungles so that they could build and construct more and more houses, because the city was expanding, the population was increasing. So that was being done. And at the same time, it was not just the common people who were doing it, but even the farmers, because now that enormous population had to be fed, and to feed those many number of people you need to grow more and more crops, and to grow and more crops you need to bring more and more land under cultivation, and that is what used to happen, and Uruk suffered. Thank you. We shall continue.